The Polaris Dawn crew performs a historic spaceflight, the European Space Agency finds a habitable planet, Zuket 3 performs a very impressive 10-kilometer hop, and New Glenn's first flight is delayed. We'll cover all that and a whole bunch more this week in Spaceflight. This week, Slingshot Aerospace detected the breakup of an old Atlas V Centaur upper stage. The rocket broke up on September 6th and left a debris cloud of at least 40 pieces in a highly elliptical orbit. This Centaur launched in 2018, carrying the GOES-17 weather satellite into a geostationary transfer orbit. After its mission, the stage moved into a so-called graveyard orbit where it would be out of the way of any active satellites. And that's where it broke up 6.5 years later. Fortunately, Slingshot has determined that the debris does not pose any immediate danger, but it does add to the ever-increasing problem of space debris, which isn't a great problem to have. Even though these pieces of debris are often very tiny, they whiz around the Earth at high velocity. If one of these pieces then encounters another piece of debris or another spacecraft, there's a lot of energy involved and thus potential for a lot of damage. Unfortunately, breakups like these are not particularly uncommon either. Astronauts in the International Space Station are occasionally ordered to shelter in their return vehicles for risk of collision with a debris field. A few years ago, a spacewalk at the ISS was cancelled after an old Russian frigate rocket stage was predicted to get very close to the station. A dangerous situation that prompted an emergency debris avoidance maneuver to get the station out of the way. Just last month, the upper stage of a Chinese Changzheng 6A broke up shortly after delivering its payload to orbit. This explosion left hundreds of pieces of space debris in low Earth orbit. This was only the rocket's 7th launch, but 4 of these launches left a lot more debris than they should have. Now, when these events happen, we're usually quick to point out that some countries or companies don't seem to care very much about littering space. But that's not the case for United Launch Alliance, which usually pacifies its spent rocket stages. This procedure often includes draining the batteries and venting all propellant, which decreases the risk of the stage exploding without external impact. Nevertheless, this wasn't the first Centaur to break up in orbit, as 3 more broke up in 2018 and 2019. What caused this is currently unknown, but Jonathan McDowell pointed out that the impact rate in geostationary transfer orbit might be higher than expected. But is it? Are we sure this won't be an issue with Centaur? SpaceX has been launching many satellites into geostationary transfer orbit, but no Falcon 9 upper stage has caused a debris field as of today. Then again, Falcon 9 hasn't been launching for as long as Atlas V and only became the workhorse rocket in recent years. There might still be a future with a lot of Falcon 9 debris. But let's hope that that future won't happen, because space debris is a serious and dangerous problem. Fortunately, many companies, including SpaceX and ULA, are taking steps to reduce it, and we hope that many more will join the club. We'd like to see these rocket stage breakups become increasingly more rare. Well, it finally happened. We got to see the launch of Polaris Dawn, and the mission has already broken some amazing records. It took a while to get there, as the mission was delayed many times, and we've covered those delays in previous episodes, but to summarize, there first was a ground-side helium leak, and then there was a slew of bad weather. This mission is more sensitive to weather than other Falcon 9 missions, as it also requires a good forecast for the return date. But on September 10th, SpaceX finally found a gap in the weather, and Falcon 9 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center at 9:23 UTC. The flight-proven booster lifted Crew Dragon Resilience into its target orbit and then returned, ending its 4th flight by successfully landing on SpaceX's drone ship Just Read the Instructions. On board Resilience is a crew of 4. This is the 2nd spaceflight for Commander Jared Isaacman, who also commanded and funded the Inspiration 4 mission a few years ago. The pilot is Scott Poteet, who had a 20-year career in the U.S. Air Force and later held various jobs at Isaacman's companies. The mission specialists on Polaris Dawn are SpaceX employees Sarah Gillis and Anna Menon. Gillis developed SpaceX's astronaut training program, and Menon previously served as biomedical flight controller for the ISS. At SpaceX, she's supported many Dragon missions in various roles, including mission director and crew communicator, or CORE as SpaceX calls it. The goal of the Polaris program is to develop new spaceflight capabilities while raising money for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Some call the program the modern-day equivalent of NASA's Gemini program, and there are some parallels, the first of which is altitude. Shortly after launch, Dragon raised its orbit to reach 1,400 kilometers at its highest point, or apogee. This broke a record set by Gemini 11 in 1966 and was the farthest that humans have ever traveled from Earth since the Apollo program. Additionally, this means that Gillis and Menon have now traveled farther from the planet than any other woman. Now, the reason for going to this altitude was not just to set a record, but also to perform research. There's a lot more radiation up there, and it's also different in terms of micrometeorites and orbital debris. All in all, it's a good place to get some necessary experience for future Moon and Mars missions. After 10 hours, Resilience lowered its altitude to a roughly 190 by 700 kilometer orbit for the rest of the mission. This also set the scene for the next milestone, the one we'd all been waiting for. 2 days into their mission on September 12th, the crew conducted the first commercial spacewalk. Officially, this extravehicular activity, or EVA, started when Dragon depressurized, but the crew had been preparing for this pretty much since they reached orbit. To get their bodies used to the lower pressure required for the EVA and to prevent decompression sickness, the pressure inside Dragon had been gradually reduced once the capsule reached orbit. At the same time, the proportion of oxygen slowly increased. On the day of the spacewalk, the crew donned their spacesuits, and after leak checks, ground teams gave the go-ahead to depressurize Dragon. This was very different compared to the way EVAs are performed at the ISS, though. The space station has an airlock, which is the only part that gets depressurized during a spacewalk. But Dragon doesn't have one, so the entire capsule is depressurized instead. This also means that everyone in the crew has to wear a spacesuit, even the astronauts who don't leave the capsule. When the pressure inside Dragon had nearly reached the vacuum of space, Isaacman opened the hatch and exited the spacecraft shortly thereafter.
There's SpaceX. Back at home, we all have a lot of work to do, but from here, Earth sure looks like a perfect world. Nice, SpaceX.
Now, if you've seen the renders that were published before this mission, you might think that he floated away from Dragon for a while, but that's not really what happened. Instead, it kind of looked more like he just poked his head out for a few minutes. But there was a bit more to it. This was the first in-space test of SpaceX's new EVA suit, and Jared had to perform a host of mobility tests to evaluate the spacesuit's performance. To help with the spacewalk, a special mobility aid called Skywalker was attached to Dragon. Isaacman held onto the structure and performed a few planned maneuvers to evaluate how easy it was to move around in the new suit. After a few minutes, Jared went back inside, after which Sarah Gillis stepped outside Dragon to repeat the procedure. With the first commercial EVA now complete, Dragon repressurized. But that doesn't mean the mission has reached all of its objectives just yet. The Polaris Dawn crew is also set to partake in medical research and perform demonstrations of communications using the Starlink laser link. Resilience is actually the first capsule outfitted with this capability. But there's also a good chance that these tests have already been completed by the time you're watching this video. Polaris Dawn is set to return after 5 days in orbit by splashing down off the coast of Florida, either in the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic. Be sure to check in next week for our story about their return. Remember the early days of Starship testing? First, there were some low-altitude tests with crude prototypes, and later some high-altitude tests with vehicles that looked a lot more finished. But what if Starhopper performed one of these high-altitude tests? Well, the Chinese company LandSpace gave us a glimpse of what that might have looked like earlier this week while testing a prototype for its Zhuge 3 rocket. It's made from stainless steel, has 3 landing legs, and 1 engine. With only a little imagination, it looks just like Hopper. So what happened at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center this week? Well, let's start from the beginning. The test vehicle ignited its engine on September 11th at 4 o'clock UTC and slowly rose up into the sky. Like Starship, Zhuge 3 is methane-powered, so the engine produced a beautiful bright blue flame. The engine slowly throttled down on the way up and cut off right as the rocket reached its highest point, or apogee, at 10 kilometers before falling back down to Earth. But if you watch the early Starship tests, you probably remember that Starship performed its signature belly flop at this point, flipping over to put the side of the rocket and its aerodynamic surfaces into the wind. Well, this prototype didn't do that. It remained upwards instead, with its engine always pointing towards the ground. After 40 seconds of falling, the prototype reignited its engine for its landing burn. This burn started at an altitude of 4.64 kilometers and lasted all the way to touchdown 200 seconds after liftoff. The vehicle safely landed on its 3 legs on a pad 3.2 kilometers from where it had taken off just minutes before. For this flight, LandSpace set out to test transonic attitude control using grid fins and cold gas thrusters, as well as gliding under high winds at high altitude and engine reignition. From the looks of it, this seems to have been a very successful test and an important milestone in the development of Zhuke 3. LandSpace hopes to debut the rocket next year, but it's expected to be much larger than the prototype that flew this week. The prototype had a diameter of 3.35 meters and a height of 18.3 meters, while the full rocket is said to be 76.6 meters tall and 4.5 meters in diameter. Its first stage is supposed to be reusable, and with this successful test flight, LandSpace now has some landing practice under its belt too. And now let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with NASA, which has recently deployed its largest ever solar sail. This is a large sheet of reflective material attached to a CubeSat. This mission was launched from New Zealand in late April, specifically to demonstrate this technology. But how does it work? Well, believe it or not, sunlight exerts a very tiny amount of pressure on whatever it hits. This sail is about 9 meters or 30 feet on the side, and the total force of sunlight pushing on it is roughly the equivalent to the weight of a paperclip lying in the palm of your hand. So it's not much, but it is just enough force for a satellite to raise and lower its altitude using nothing but sunlight. Scaled up, this technology could potentially power low-cost missions to the moon and beyond. And something else kind of neat, the light reflected from this solar sail is so bright that it can be seen from Earth. And if you want to see it, NASA has added a Spot the Sail augmented reality tool to its mobile app that'll help you find viewing opportunities at your location. Starliner Calypso is finally back on Earth. This week, it ended its tumultuous crew flight test by landing without crew. Now, we've been following this story ever since the mission first lifted off in early June, and while NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams safely arrived at the ISS, the journey up was plagued by misbehaving thrusters and helium leaks. What was supposed to be just an 8-day mission turned into a very, very long story while Boeing and NASA tried to diagnose all of the issues. Eventually, NASA decided that it was safer to let Butch and Sunny stay up on the station so that they could later return home on Crew Dragon next year. But that meant Calypso now had to come down without its crew, and that happened this week on September 6th. At 22:04 Universal Time, Starliner undocked from the station and performed a few quick burns to quickly evacuate the safe zone around the ISS. Fortunately, this part went smoothly and without any issues. Later, on the way home, one of the 12 reaction control thrusters on the capsule itself refused to fire though, but fortunately a backup thruster was able to take over. It should be noted, however, that these are completely different thrusters than the ones that caused the earlier issues. But finally, Starliner performed its deorbit burn and separated its crew and service modules as planned. Calypso re-entered and touched down at the White Sands Space Harbor in New Mexico on September 7th at 4:01 UTC. With Starliner back on the ground, NASA and Boeing are now evaluating the mission to decide what's next for Starliner. Whatever it is, we'll be sure to cover it on a future episode of This Week in Spaceflight. NASA recently shared photos of a wind tunnel test for SpaceX's Super Heavy booster. Now, of course, there's no wind tunnel big enough to fit an actual Super Heavy, so SpaceX used a small but detailed 1.2% scale model of the booster for the test. The model was outfitted with sensors and placed in a wind tunnel at NASA's Ames Research Center in California. During the test, the model was subjected to winds up to Mach 1.4, or 1.4 times the speed of sound. While many tests are done using computer simulations, physical tests just like these are often still used to verify computer models or to test things that just can't be simulated. Now, while it's not clear when these tests took place, NASA did reveal that SpaceX used the results of the test to update the flight software ahead of Starship's third flight test in March of this year. NASA has delayed its Escapade Mars mission to no earlier than spring of next year. In previous episodes, we've covered how Blue Origin has been rushing to get New Glenn ready to fly Escapade during the upcoming October launch window, but it just wasn't meant to be. NASA decided that delays would be too likely and too costly if it went ahead with the October window. But Blue Origin isn't planning to wait. The company announced on social media that it supports NASA's decision, but will now try to launch a different payload on New Glenn's first flight instead. That payload is a demonstration mission of Blue Origin's space tug called Blue Ring. This mission was originally scheduled for December, but it's now moved into November. Blue still has its work cut out before it can launch New Glenn for the first time. In fact, very recently, the company was still integrating engines onto the flight first stage. Both flight stages have yet to be test fired, but once that's done, the rocket can finally be stacked for flight. Blue Origin is performing all of these procedures for the very first time, so further delays could be likely if issues arise. We'll have to see what happens next, but it'll be an exciting time regardless. The European Space Agency's JUICE mission discovered a habitable planet, and the name of that planet is Earth! Yes, Earth, our home planet! But wait, why does ESA need a mission to confirm Earth's habitability? Well, if you remember, JUICE is short for Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, and it flew by Earth for a gravity assist just a few weeks ago. The main purpose of that maneuver was to get the spacecraft on the right trajectory so it'll eventually be able to reach Jupiter. But it also provided scientists with an excellent opportunity to test and calibrate JUICE's instruments. During the flyby, the spacecraft studied Earth's atmosphere with its sub-millimeter wave instrument, which listened for signals of molecules that contain the most common ingredients for life. Another instrument, the Moons and Jupiter Imaging Spectrometer, or MAJIS, observed the planet in infrared light to make temperature maps. It also detected important molecules in Earth's atmosphere, such as oxygen, ozone, carbon dioxide, and water. Of course, no one is surprised to learn that Earth is habitable, but it is extremely useful to know that JUICE can in fact detect the ingredients for life. One of the mission's main goals is to find out whether the oceans on Jupiter's icy moons have the conditions that are necessary for life to survive. While JUICE still has a long way to go, we now know that it has what it takes to make surprising discoveries once it finally gets there. Now let's take a look at all the space traffic this week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week, of course, we had the uncrewed return of Boeing's Starliner Calypso spacecraft from the International Space Station. With this capsule return, Sunny and Butch will now remain on station until it's their time to return home on Crew Dragon Freedom in February of 2025 as part of SpaceX's Crew 9 mission. That mission is now scheduled to launch no earlier than September 25th at 1828 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida with NASA astronaut Nick Hague and Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov. The two crew members have already entered the routine pre-flight quarantine and are set to arrive at the Kennedy Space Center next week on September 20th. This week we also had the launch of the amazing Polaris Dawn mission, which we covered in detail earlier. Looking ahead, there are about 2 more days for the crew before returning home. They're expected to conduct several more science investigations while in orbit and will continue to test the Starlink laser system installed on Resilience. Based on marine hazard notices for Dragon Splashdown, a return for Resilience and its crew of 4 could happen as soon as September 14th between 6 o'clock and 10:30 UTC. Continuing with the record-breaking crew missions, this week we also had the launch of a Soyuz spacecraft with a crew of 3 headed to the International Space Station as part of the next crew rotation mission. Liftoff of the Soyuz 2.1A rocket with the Soyuz MS-26 spacecraft took place on September 11th at 16:23 UTC from Site 31-6 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. On board were Commander Alexei Ovchinin and Flight Director Ivan Wagner, both Roscosmos cosmonauts, and Flight Engineer Don Pettit, a NASA astronaut. The trio was sent on a fast-track 2-orbit rendezvous with the ISS, docking to the Rassvet module just a bit over 3 hours later at 1932 UTC. After hatch opening, they joined the crews of Soyuz MS-25, Crew 8, and Sunny and Butch, who had launched on Starliner. This launch broke the record for most people in orbit at 19. 12 of these people are currently living on the ISS, 3 are living inside the Chinese space station, and at least for a few more days, we also have another 4 people in orbit on the Polaris Dawn mission. Somewhat ironic is that the whole reason this record's even possible is because Sunny and Butch remained on the station instead of coming down on Starliner. Up until now, the record had been 17 people in orbit, which was established last year when 2 Shenzhou crews, 15 and 16, had met at the Chinese space station, while on the ISS there were 2 Crew Dragon missions underway, Crew 6 and Axiom 2, and a Soyuz crew as well, Soyuz MS-23. Add another 2 astronauts, and voila, you've got 19 in orbit. Continuing with the exciting week of launches, we had another Falcon 9 mission taking place from Florida. The launch took place on September 12th at 8:52 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40, carrying the first 5 satellites of AST Space Mobile's Bluebird Block 1 constellation into a low Earth orbit. This constellation is aimed at delivering cellular connectivity from space to unmodified phones on the ground, similar to how Globalstar or Starlink direct-to-cell works. The Bluebird satellites take advantage of giant deployable phased array antennas to act as cell towers in space, connecting to cell phones on the ground without the need for any special modifications. These initial 5 satellites are just the start of a much larger constellation of nearly 100 satellites that the company plans to deploy over the next few years, which will be followed by even more improved and larger satellites later in the decade. The total mass of the satellites at launch was about 7.5 tons, with SpaceX developing a rather peculiar-looking payload adapter to hold all 5 at once. Despite this, the first stage for this mission, B-1078, was flying for a 13th time and still had enough performance to return all the way back to the Cape. While spacewalk preparations for Polaris Dawn obviously grabbed everyone's attention, the boost back burn for this mission put on an amazing show in the sky, probably one of the best examples of what we refer to as the Falcon Nebula. B-1078 successfully returned to landing zone 1 and sent sonic booms across the space coast. And just last night, we had the launch of a Falcon 9 rocket with more Starlinks out of Vandenberg. The rocket was carrying 13 Starlink direct-to-cell and 8 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The first stage for this mission, B-1071, was flying for an 18th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship Of Course I Still Love You. With this launch, SpaceX has now launched a total of 7,022 Starlink satellites, of which 607 have re-entered and 5,996 have moved into their operational orbit. Coming up next week, we'll have at least 2 launches, one from SpaceX and another one from Rocket Lab. The first mission will be a Falcon 9 rocket carrying the next 2 Galileo Global Positioning satellites for the European Commission. The launch is currently scheduled to take place on September 15th at 22:57 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The second will be an Electron rocket carrying out the mission called CASC Killed the Radio Star, with an IoT on the end of radio because it'll be carrying the next 5 satellites of a constellation for French Internet of Things company CASC. The launch, set to take place from New Zealand, is currently scheduled for September 16th at 23:02 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and I'll see you all again next week to recap This Week in Spaceflight.